There were 3 slave revolts in Rome during the period from 135 to 70 BC. The third of these was the Gladiator Revolt led by Spartacus, and is by far the most famous of the 3. The Third Servile War was the only one to directly threaten the Roman heartland of Italia and was doubly alarming to the Roman people due to the repeated successes of the rapidly growing band of rebel slaves against the Roman army between 73 and 71 BC. The story of Spartacus has been told by historians, novelists, and filmmakers up to the present day, when it enjoys a wide following as a very popular television series, but admiration for the hero of the Third Servile War is nothing new. In the Roman Republic of the 1st century BC, gladiatorial games were one of the more popular forms of entertainment. In order to supply gladiators for the contests, several training schools were established throughout Italia. In these schools, prisoners of war and condemned criminals, who were considered slaves, were taught the skills required to fight to the death in gladiatorial games. In 73 BC, a group of some 200 gladiators in the Capuan school owned by Lentulus Vitiatus plotted an escape. When their plot was betrayed, a force of about 70 men seized implements from the kitchen, fought their way free from the school, and seized several wagons of gladiatorial weapons and armor. Once free, the escaped gladiators chose leaders from their number, selecting 2 Gallic slaves, Crixus and Enemaus, and Spartacus, who was said either to be a Thracian auxiliary from the Roman legions later condemned to slavery, or a captive taken by the legions. These escaped slaves were able to defeat a small force of troops sent after them from Capua, and equip themselves with captured military equipment as well as their gladiatorial weapons. Sources are somewhat contradictory on the order of events immediately following the escape, but they generally agree that this band of escaped gladiators plundered the region surrounding Capua, recruited many other slaves into their ranks, and eventually retired to a more defensible position on Mount Vesuvius. News of the revolt spread quickly, and many of the slaves from the plantations throughout the country left their homes and joined the rebels. The Roman Senate considered all of this more of a bother than a threat and sent a force of largely untrained soldiers under the general Gaius Claudius Glaber to take care of the problem. This 3,000 men strong army was raised not as legions, but as a militia, picked up in haste and at random, for the Romans did not consider this a war yet, but a raid, something like an attack of robbery. Glaber and the Senate seem to have thought that a group of runaway slaves would be easily defeated, as they could not possibly know anything about military tactics or warfare. Glaber's forces besieged the slaves on Mount Vesuvius, blocking the only known way down the mountain. With the slaves thus contained, Glaber was content to wait until starvation forced the slaves to surrender. While the slaves lacked military training, Spartacus' forces displayed ingenuity in their use of available local materials, and in their use of clever, unorthodox tactics when facing the disciplined Roman armies. In response to Glaber's siege, Spartacus' men made ropes and ladders from vines and trees growing on the slopes of Vesuvius and used them to rappel down the cliffs on the side of the mountain opposite Glaber's forces. They moved around the base of Vesuvius, outflanked the army, and a chaotic battle ensued. The sun had just risen over Mount Vesuvius, casting its rays across the valley where 2 armies stood, waiting for the inevitable clash. On one side stood the mighty army of Spartacus, consisting of former slaves and gladiators who had been fighting for their freedom for years. On the other side was the Roman militia army led by Gaius Claudius Glaber, determined to crush the rebellion and uphold the glory of the Roman Republic. The gladiators were outnumbered and outmatched in terms of training and equipment, but they had the advantage of desperation and the will to fight for their freedom. Spartacus, their leader, stood at the front of the army, his eyes blazing with determination and his sword held high. He knew that this battle could very well decide the fate of his people and their quest for liberation. Glaber, on the other hand, was confident in his troops' ability to defeat the rebel army. He had trained his militia army well, though they were not well equipped and battle-hardened as Roman legion, but they still held the advantage over slave army in this matter. He stood at the front of his troops, his eyes fixed on Spartacus and his sword drawn. The slave army charged towards the Romans, the ground trembling under their feet. The clash of metal echoed through the valley as swords and shields clashed, and the battle began in earnest. Though slave army was able to outflank the Roman militia's superior training and discipline gave them the initial advantage, as they formed a wall of shields and pushed back the gladiators. The clash was brutal and savage. But the gladiators were not so easily defeated. The gladiators fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that their lives and their freedom were on the line. They fought with a fierce determination, fueled by their years of slavery and oppression. They fought with a ferocity that surprised even the seasoned Roman soldiers, their swords and axes cutting through the Roman shield wall. They hacked and slashed at the Roman shields with their swords and axes, trying to find a gap in the wall of steel that confronted them. The Roman militia fought with a disciplined precision, holding their formation and thrusting their spears at the oncoming horde of gladiators. Spartacus himself fought with a skill and bravery that inspired his troops. He charged into the heart of the Roman militia, his sword slashing and cutting through the enemy's soldiers with ease. The battle raged on for hours, the sun beating down mercilessly on the combatants. The gladiators were outnumbered and outmatched, but they fought with a determination that could not be quenched. As the battle wore on, it became clear that the gladiators were beginning to gain the upper hand. Their fighting spirit and desperation gave them an edge over the militia, who were beginning to tire and falter. Sensing victory, Spartacus ordered a full charge, and the gladiators surged forward with renewed vigor. The militia fought back fiercely, but they were no match for the ferocity of the gladiators. The battle turned into a rout, with the Romans retreating in disarray as the gladiators pursued them relentlessly. The ground was littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, and the air was thick with the smell of blood and sweat. In the end, the gladiator army emerged victorious. Spartacus stood atop a hill overlooking the battlefield, his sword held high in triumph. The surviving militia soldiers were taken captive and forced to surrender, their fate uncertain. The gladiators had won their freedom, but at a great cost. The battle had been brutal and bloody, and many had lost their lives in the fight. But the gladiators knew that they had proven themselves capable of standing up to the might of the Roman Republic, and that their struggle for freedom would continue.